Some time ago, there was a missionary by the name of John Patton who served in the South Pacific Islands with his wife. And one night, they were in the home that they shared on the island that they lived on. They had taken the gospel to a group of tribal peoples, people that were cannibals, and they were headhunters, and they were idol worshipers. Yet John Patton and his wife felt called to share the gospel with these people. God had put it upon their hearts that this is where they were to go. And one night they found themselves in their home, and their home was surrounded by tribal warriors who were wanting to come in there and take their life because they were preaching a God that was different from the idols that they had worshipped before. And as they looked out the window of their home and they saw it surrounded by these tribal warriors, Patton wrote that he and his wife just began to pray. They looked out the window and they prayed, and they prayed, and they prayed, and they prayed. And as they continued to pray, eventually the sun came up and all of the warriors went home. And they knew that God had delivered them that night, didn't know the reason, but they were thankful nonetheless. And a year after that happened, the chief of that tribe came to know Jesus Christ. He came to recognize Jesus for who he was, as an all-sufficient Savior who was gracious and merciful. And John Patton, when ministering to that chief, asked him about what had happened a year earlier, and he said, "How come you did not come in and kill me that night?" And he said, "Because as we surrounded your house and waited to come in, we saw the men walking around it with white robes, and we were too scared to come close. And they had seen the very angels of God standing in front of that house, and therefore were afraid to attack that night. For whatever reason God had, he intervened, because he had a purpose for John Patton and for his family there on that island to take the gospel to these tribal peoples. And it wasn't because they deserved to live, but for some reason God decided to put his hand of protection upon him. Now this morning I want us to look at the protection of God in the life of David. And if you will open your Bibles with me to 1 Samuel chapter 18. This morning we're going to be looking at 1 Samuel chapter 18. And as we look at the story of God's protection in David's life, we're actually going to see that a lot from here on out. But we are going to see much more than a soap opera about David's relationship with the royal family of Israel. We're going to see something very significant about the way that God works in the lives of people. And what I want you to do this morning is be patient with me as I walk you through this story. And when we get to the end of the story, I'm going to come back and show you why this message is so pertinent to us, why it is so meaningful to people today, just as much as it ever was in David's day. And I would say it's because it's all but forgotten in the day that we live in. As chapter 18 begins, you'll remember that in chapter 17, David has just defeated the Philistine giant Goliath. He has done what every other Israelite was afraid to do. He has done that which even King Saul was afraid to do. And he stood there confident in God, with the zeal for the God that he served, and he took down the giant warrior. Now at this point, people were happy with David. Saul was happy with David. David had been a part of Saul's household. If you remember, he would come in and play the harp for Saul as the evil spirit had tormented him. And every time David would play the harp, that spirit would stop tormenting him and his headaches would go away. And now after he defeated this giant, David was more than welcome in Saul's house. In chapter 18, verse 2 says that Saul took him and would not let him go home to his father's house anymore. And things were going well at the beginning with David and Saul. But I want you to know it's not just Saul that took a kindness toward David. Saul's family took a kindness toward David as well. As we look at this story, you're going to see a great contrast between the way that David was treated by Saul's family and the way that David was treated by Saul. He became very close friends with his son Jonathan. Verse 1 says, "Now when he had finished speaking to Saul, The soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him go home to his father's house anymore. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan took off the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, even to his sword and his bow and his belt. You see, David and Jonathan had bonded like people don't normally bond. They had a closeness between them that was closer than most friends ever have. It says that Jonathan loved David so much, it says that their souls were knit together and that he loved him as he loved his own soul. These men were going to be friends until the end. Jonathan's soul was knit to David in such a way as that he would die as a person who would not betray that friendship. And he did so because he thought it glorified the Almighty God that he served. But I want you to see how Saul's reaction became towards David, because as time went on, after the incident with Goliath, things began to change with Saul. Verse 5 says, "So David went out wherever Saul sent him and behaved wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants." Things seemed to be going very well. Well, verse 6 tells us, "Now it happened as they were coming home, when David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women had come out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. So the women sang as they danced, 'Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s.'" Now, friends, there was a problem here. Things were not going so well in Israel when this began to happen. Saul was very happy when all the women came out to greet him. But all of a sudden now he hears these words, "Saul has slain his thousands," and that sounds great, until he hears it followed by the phrase that David has slain his 10,000s. And the jealousy began to well up inside of him. Because you see, the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul. Saul had been told by the prophet Samuel that his kingdom was going to be removed. Saul's pride in his entire life was his dynasty and what he was going to leave to his family. And now it says that the people were chanting David's name. Saul has slain his thousands. David has slain his 10,000s. And you know what? This would have been bad enough if it were the men of Israel saying this. But it says that the women sang as they danced. And now that the women of Israel are chanting David's name, that leads to very big problems. Ladies, if you ever want to frustrate your man, just start singing the praises of some other man and see how he reacts. I promise you, it will not go well, especially if you talk about what great hair he has, because then we don't like that at all, I promise, amen? But even the women of Israel were chanting David's name, and they were singing the praises to David, and Saul began to get jealous. He got angry, and verse 8 says that Saul was very angry, and the saying displeased him, and he said, "They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed only thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom?" You see, the jealousy began to well up inside of him because he knew where this was going to lead. Saul himself was the one that was cowering down before the giant. If anyone in Israel should have been willing to go up against Goliath, it should have been Saul, their fearless leader, who was a head and shoulders taller than anyone else in the nation. But no, it was little David. And now little David is receiving the glory that Saul himself wanted to keep. And the one thing that Saul holds on to with a tight fist is the kingdom of Israel. The one thing that he doesn't want to let go, we've seen throughout the book of Samuel up until this point that his relationship with the Lord is almost of no account. He doesn't seem to be worried about the fact that the Spirit of God has departed from him. As a matter of fact, he's already been told that the reason he was in so much distress was that the Lord had sent an evil spirit upon him. And he seems more worried about relieving the pain than he does about making things right with God. You see, that's not what Saul's priority was. His priority was keeping his kingdom. And now that people are singing the praises of young David, Saul can see what's on the horizon. He says, if this is what is happening now, what is left but the kingdom? So Saul eyed David from that day forward. You might say he envied David from that day forward, because envy always begins with the eyes. He saw what was happening to David. He saw the blessing that God was putting on David's life. And much more so for Saul, he was seeing the praise that David was receiving. And therefore he envied him. He eyed him from that day forward. And we see that David, the very one that God used as an instrument of mercy in Saul's life, the one that God used to soothe his pain and to calm him when he was distressed, is now going to be the one that is going to be a great source of turmoil for Saul. And while he was a source of mercy, he will now be the one that takes the kingdom from him. Verse 10 says, and it happened on the next day that the distressing spirit from God came upon Saul. And he prophesied inside the house. So David played music with his hand as at other times. But there was a spear in Saul's hand. And Saul cast the spear, for he said, I will pin David to the wall. And by pin David to the wall, he doesn't mean pin him by his shirt, okay? He means to put the spear through him and into the wall. I will pin David to the wall. But David escaped his presence twice. Now Saul was afraid of David, because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. Therefore Saul removed him from his presence, and he made him his captain over 1,000. And he went out and he came in before the people. And David behaved wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Therefore, when Saul saw that he had behaved very wisely, he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, because he went out and came in before them. I want you to know that where he was a source of comfort, he was now a source of trouble. Saul was jealous. He hated the praise that David was getting. And instead of feeling relieved when David was playing the harp, he now decided to kill David by throwing a spear at him as he played the harp. And it appears that this was not something that happened only once, because verse 11 tells us that David escaped him not only once, but he escaped him twice. And you know what is interesting about this story is that Saul was the king of Israel, and he was big, and he was mighty, and he was powerful. And Saul was the one who had the spear in his hand, and David was Saul's servant. Yet verse 12 tells us that Saul was afraid of David. That comes as somewhat of a shocker as you're reading the story, doesn't it? Because as you read about Saul and his pride, the last thing that you expect is for him to be afraid of David. If anybody was going to be afraid of the other, you would expect that David might be afraid of Saul. But it says here that Saul was afraid of David, and we ask why. Well, the Bible tells us because the Lord was with him, but he had departed from Saul. You see, it wasn't David's relationship with the Lord that I believe Saul was so worried about, because Saul didn't seem too concerned about his own relationship. I think what he was concerned about is the fact that because David had God's blessing on his life, he was able to do many things that Saul felt he should be able to do and would no longer have the ability to do. Because it was only when the Spirit of the Lord was upon him that he was able to do great things as the king of Israel. And now he recognized that not only had the Spirit of God departed from him, but it was with David. And that is what scared Saul. It's not that he looked at this small young man and was intimidated by his presence. It was the fact that God was with him. And therefore he removed him. And he made him captain over 1,000. Now, why would Saul do such a thing? If Saul was scared of David, and if Saul was jealous of David, and if his love for David had waned, why on earth would he do such a thing as reward him by making him the captain over 1,000? Well, we're going to see in verse 17, but the answer is in the fact that Saul still wanted David to die, but he was rewarding him because he was hoping the enemy would do what he could not do himself. But what was it that made David successful up until this point? Well, verse 12 says that Saul was afraid of David because God was with him. Verse 14 says the Lord was with him. And we see that David was blessed because the Lord was with him in all that he did. Israel and Judah loved him because he went out and came in before them, but Saul was afraid of him. And then in verse 17, we see that Saul offers his daughter to David as a prize. If you remember back in chapter 17, whenever David walked up to the valley of Elah and saw the scene that was going on as Goliath was yelling insults across the canyon, we see that there was a reward offered by the king to anyone who would take down this uncircumcised Philistine. And that reward, number one, was that he would give this man his daughter in marriage. Number two, that he would never have to pay taxes again, and that he would make him wealthy. And you see, Saul had already been falling down in the eyes of the people. He had already started to take a back seat while David was moving up front. But in order to save face, Saul needed to keep the very words which he had said. So he offers his daughter Merab to David as a wife, but it appears that she had been given to someone else as a wife whenever Saul offered her. So Saul, in verse 20, recognizes that his daughter Michal, or Michael, however you say her name, he recognizes that Michal had a great love for David. And he knows that she wanted to be his wife. And he thought that was the perfect opportunity because he was able to fulfill his word of giving this young man a wife from among his daughters. And it says that she loved David, and that pleased Saul. And Saul said, I will give her to him, in verse 21, so that she may be a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Therefore Saul said to David a second time, you shall be my son-in-law. Well, David was overwhelmed with gratitude that the king would think so much of him as to give little David, young David, his daughter as a wife. And he said, who am I to be the son-in-law of the king? I come from a poor family. What do I have to offer? And in verse 25 it says, Saul said, thus you shall say to David, the king does not desire any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines. Why 100 foreskins of the Philistines? Because that means that 100 Philistines are dead. He says, I want this to take vengeance on the king's enemies. But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. He wants David to be zealous for the Lord and for their country. But his hope is that in his zeal, he will get killed. And therefore all the glory in Israel will then be restored to Saul. So when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to become the king's son-in-law. And the days had not expired. Therefore David arose, and he went, he and his men. And while Saul is hoping that he will die at the hand of the Philistines by giving him an impossible task to carry out, by killing 100 Philistines, it says that David went and killed 200 men of the Philistines, and brought their foreskins and gave them in full count to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, as a wife. Thus Saul knew, he saw and he knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. And Saul was still more afraid of David. So Saul became David's enemy continually. He didn't just become his enemy, he stayed his enemy. Then the princes of the Philistines went out to war, and so it was, whenever they went out, that David behaved more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name became highly esteemed. And I ask the question again, what was it that caused David's success? And what was it that contributed to Saul's lack of it? And the answer is that while the Spirit of God had departed from Saul, that God was continually with David. David was successful because God was with him. Nothing will stop God from accomplishing His purposes. When you read this story, I hope that you can see that. Nothing will stop God from accomplishing His purposes. You see, Saul had opposed God at every turn. Saul had done all that he could in his power so that God's plan would not prevail. He knew that God's plan was to take him off of the throne. He knew that he was going to be removed from the kingdom. He knew that God's blessing was upon David, and he still tried to oppose God's plan at every turn. And I want you to know that opposing him will not work, because you cannot thwart the plan of an almighty God. Saul found this out the hard way. But the more he tried to oppose the plan of God, the more that God's glory was revealed through David. And this is not something that is unique to Saul and David. You see this throughout the Scriptures. You see God working this way. You see that the stronger people resist His will, the more people oppose His plan, the greater His glory is shown. If you remember, whenever all of Israel had moved into Egypt because of the famine, the Pharaoh that was over Egypt during the oppression of the Israelite people, he was worried because the Hebrews were becoming so large in number. Do you remember that? You remember what Pharaoh did? He ordered that all of the male babies from Israel be killed because he did not want them to outnumber the Egyptians. And even though he ordered them killed, and even though he tried to stop the plan of their God, God multiplied them even greater than He had before. Because the more you oppose God's plan, the greater He will reveal His glory through someone else. And the same thing happened a generation later when Moses was grown and the Pharaoh of the Exodus was there. And Moses came and said the word of the Lord to Pharaoh and said, "Let my people go." And as Pharaoh's heart was hardened, he wouldn't let God's people go, would he? He resisted the plan of God to send His people out in the wilderness. And 10 times he would not let God's people go. And God's glory was revealed through Pharaoh's stubbornness more than it ever had been before. The greatest act of deliverance in the history of Israel took place whenever the Passover swept over Egypt and the people were released. The greater we oppose His plan, the more His glory will be revealed. Opposing Him will not work. We see it again in the exile. In 722 BC, the southern kingdom had fallen to the Assyrians. 100 and something years later, 586, the people of Judah fell to the Babylonians. And what used to be the land of the people of God appeared to be no more. The people of Israel weren't living in Israel. The people of Israel were taken into exile. But if you remember, among all of those exiles that were taken into Babylon, there was a young man named Daniel, wasn't there? Daniel had 3 friends that were there in exile with him. And Daniel and his 3 friends were used by God as instruments of redemption, even in Babylon, while Israel remained a desolate wasteland. Because the more that God's plan was opposed, the greater He showed His glory through other people. The greater the opposition, the greater that God works to reveal the glory of His majesty. His glory will not be diminished, and the opposition will not win. The opposition will never win, because He is the Almighty and the all-glorious God who created heaven and earth. When I was in the Navy, I had a very good friend that I served with, and we were stationed in San Diego, California. That's where we were home ported. And he had a grandfather that lived in Newport Beach, which was not very far from there, about an hour's drive. And his grandfather was someone that we looked up to because he had had a career on the ocean that had spanned over 50 years. He had been a captain in the Navy and retired from the Navy and had another 20 years as a captain on the Alaskan ferry lines. And this man was somewhat of an idol in our eyes. He had been the commanding officer of an experimental diving unit in the Navy, had gone diving with Jacques Cousteau. He was also the commanding officer of an icebreaker, and they worked in the Arctic Circle in Operation Deep Freeze. I remember talking to him, and he was very old by the time that I met him, and he had retired and was living in Newport Beach. But he used to tell us about what it was like to work in the Arctic Circle, and he was telling us things that we had not known before about icebergs. Now, I've never seen an iceberg, so it goes to show that I wouldn't know very much about them. I've seen them on TV, seen them in movies, but I've never seen icebergs up close. But he told me some things about icebergs that I did not know. He said, if you are on the ocean surrounded by icebergs, if you look at the field of icebergs, you will notice something, and that's that the icebergs are moving in different directions. And I had never known that before. And I said, why did the icebergs move in different directions? And he told me. He said, the reason that icebergs move in different directions is because some icebergs are larger than other ones. You have small icebergs, and you have large icebergs where the majority of the berg is beneath the surface of the water and goes very deep beneath the surface of the ocean. And these smaller icebergs are moved around by the winds and the storms on the surface. But these larger icebergs, well, they're pushed by the undercurrent of the sea. So therefore, they're moving in different directions than the smaller icebergs are. And, you know, the more I think about it, the more that I believe we are a lot like those icebergs. Because while we're pushed in many different directions by the winds and by the storms of life, we have many things happen to us. We all suffer in different ways. But while we look at the different paths that each one of us are being blown across, beneath all of it, you see the undercurrent of the sovereign hand of God making sure that His will is accomplished. As we look at this story this morning about David escaping from Saul, you know, there's a lot of lessons that can be gleaned from this story. People take away from this story lessons about friendship, with David and Jonathan loving each other so much and having their souls knit together. We take away stories of courage and bravery, but those things are not the point that the Bible is trying to convey. What is it that we need to take from this story? We see it 3 times. We see it in verse 12. Saul was afraid because the Lord was with David. Verse 14, David behaved wisely and the Lord was with him. Verse 28, thus Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David. 3 times in that passage we are told that the Lord was with him. So what is it that we are supposed to take away from this story? Let me just give you a tip on interpreting the Bible. Anytime you see something repeated over and over and over in the passage, that's something that we're supposed to take away. What is the point? The point is that God was with him, and that no matter what happened to thwart God's plan, it would not succeed. You know, the American Indians, they used to do something that was very unique. I read and how they would train their young braves. And this was very interesting to read this. What they would do is they would teach them how to hunt, how to survive, how to fish. And after passing, I guess you could say, a series of tests that show they knew how to do those things, a young brave on his 13th birthday would be taken at nighttime several miles away from the camp. And they would take them into the middle of the wilderness somewhere. And they would leave them in the wilderness. They would take them blindfolded not remove the blindfold until they got there and leave the young brave there in the middle of the dark, miles from anywhere. And as the young brave would open his eyes and sit there in the darkness, every little sound probably would remind him of an animal that was about to pounce on him. I'm sure that every noise that he heard was coming close to terrifying him. But as the young brave would sit there throughout the night, and as the sun would rise in the morning, he would start to see a few things. He would start to see the path being lit in front of him. He would start to see the shadows of the trees as the light came up over the horizon and the shadows began to appear. And finally he would see, just a few feet away, was standing his father. The father was always there to make sure that the young brave got through the night. He was there and he was terrified about all the forces that were around him, but all the time he was under the watchful hand of his father. The one thing that could be said about that brave in the middle of the wilderness is that his father was with him. And you know, the greatest thing that can be said about any one of us is that God is with us. You know, there's nothing greater that anyone can say to you than the fact that God is with you. There's nothing greater that someone can say to me than to tell me that God is with me, because that is the very greatest thing that we can ask for, is for God to be with us the way that God was with David. And you know, as we get ready to celebrate the Christmas season and we look into the Christmas story, the Gospel of Matthew tells us, doesn't it? Chapter 1, as the angel visited Joseph, he said, "Behold, the virgin shall bear a son and call his name Emmanuel." God with us. The word Emmanuel means God with us. And I want you to know that as Jesus Christ came into this world, there were a lot of forces that opposed him too. As the plan of God was carried out in the life of Jesus Christ, I want you to know that he met much opposition. He met opposition at the hands of blasphemers. He met opposition at the hands of the Jews. He met opposition at the hands of Roman soldiers. And I want you to know that the opposition was so great that the hands of lawless men put Jesus Christ up on a cross to suffer a death that was the most shameful that any man could suffer. But out of that opposition came the greatest glory that has ever been given to God. Because whenever Jesus died upon that cross, he did it so that people like you and I might be able to stand before a holy God. He did it because people like you and I, whom God has chosen to forgive, who have no hope of ever being able to stand in the presence of his holiness, he did it to take upon himself the very wrath that belongs to us, and therefore clothe us with his perfect righteousness so we could walk directly into the kingdom, directly into the gates of heaven, and to stand in the very presence of a holy God. Now those who look up to Jesus Christ, those who look upon him for what he accomplished on that cross, those who trust in him, recognizing that he is the king over all of heaven and the earth, and there is none that can compare to him, those who trust in his name have learned that to them, he has become Emmanuel. He has become God with us. And I want to ask you, is God with you today? As we look at the story of David and we see the empowering that God brought upon his life because God was with him, I want you to ask yourself this morning, is God with you? Have you lost the joy of life because you don't know what it feels like to have God with you? Maybe you need to have God with you the way that God was with David. And my prayer, if that is the case, is that today you will look up and call Jesus Emmanuel. That you will look up unto him as the only one who is able to save you. As the only one who is able to take upon himself what you deserve so that you may have a chance, so that you may have the opportunity to walk in the presence of a holy God. The greatest thing that can ever be said is that God is with us. And I pray that today God is with you too. Let us pray.